if we now have a completely evolutionary universe with the Big Bang and the whole process following on from that, then isn't it possible, he's really asking the question, that the laws of nature could also evolve and resemble more habits than actual laws.
Hello everybody and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. So today we're going to be examining the assumptions of Western science. All science is based on assumptions. In order to isolate the systems in experiments and standardize measurements of the target data, other variables quite simply need to be pinned down so scientists can form precise mathematical models that can then be repeated accurately in the peer review process. So today we're going to look at these assumptions and establish if they indeed have become standard, fixed, and unquestioned, as some critics claim. One of those critics is Cambridge-educated biologist Rupert Sheldrake, who gave a TED Talk in 2013 about the assumptions of Western science, which was then banned by TED's anonymous board of scientific advisors for not being a fair description of scientific assumptions. Far from calming the controversy, the ban caused an outcry of censorship, and the RIP video was seen by millions of people on YouTube, probably many times more than had it been left to stand as one scientist's opinion. Today, I want to examine just how fair his description was. So Sheldrake starts by identifying a conflict between science as a method of inquiry based on reason, evidence, hypothesis, and collective investigation, and science as a belief system or worldview. He argues that the belief system part, when it reaches evidence that contradicts its beliefs, rejects that evidence rather than updating its beliefs. Sheldrake argues that this goes against the very objective of free inquiry and scientific endeavor, which is the search for truth. And it tends towards an imposed dogma, something we tend to associate more with a religious worldview. So the main subject of today's conversation is going to be Sheldrake's book about all of this, Science Set Free, provocatively called The Science Delusion by his UK publisher, which has, despite doubling sales, sadly put off many professional scientists who would otherwise have supported many of his points. In it, he lists 10 examples of assumptions of Western science, which most of us with scientific, secular educations wouldn't even question. And he turns them into questions to scrutinize scientifically. Dr. Sheldrake won't be joining us today for this episode, but will hopefully be with us in Series 2 to talk about his controversial theory of morphic resonance and his research into psychic phenomena. So to help us examine his claims is one of Rupert's old friends and supporters, author and program director of the Scientific and Medical Network, David Lorimer. He is also president of the Recon Trust and chief consultant of Character Education Scotland. He's a former president of the Swedenborg Society and vice president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. Originally a merchant banker and then a teacher of philosophy and modern languages at Winchester College, he is the author and editor of over a dozen books, most recently The Protein Crunch with Jason Drew and A New Renaissance. And out this year, his new book, A Quest for Wisdom. He is the originator of the Inspire, Aspire Values poster programs, which this year involved over 25,000 young people. So this is going to be crunchy, it's going to be controversial, but I love walking that tightrope right at the edge of science. So without further ado, let's go. Hello, everybody, and welcome to David Lorimer. Thank you so much for coming on the show, David.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
David, I'm always deeply curious to ask my guests what were the big questions that fascinated them and maybe even troubled them a little when they first started their conscious experience, the first big questions that you started to think about that may have maybe gone on to sort of motivate your career choices. For you, what were the questions that were just too big to ignore that may have led to your interest in philosophy and science?
Well, I suppose there are sort of two angles I could take on that one. The first is to say that when I was at St Andrews in the 70s and doing an arts degree, it was compulsory to do a year of philosophy, and had been since the 18th or even 17th century, because this idea of being informed about logic and moral philosophy, it was logic and metaphysics on the one hand and moral philosophy on the other, was thought to be an integral part of a Scottish person's education. And so this was still the case in the 1970s. Sadly, it no longer is. And so I was forced to do this year of philosophy, where there were two courses that I did which were of particular interest. One was called Theories of Human Nature, and the other was on existentialism, which is quite unusual because British philosophers don't really pay any attention to existentialism. It's a kind of continental eccentricity. And this then related to the study I was doing at the time as well of French 20th century authors, particularly Sartre and Camus. And so there was a nice feeling of synergy there. And that's when you're asking yourselves these questions, what is it all about? And you have these conversations, sort of wine-fueled conversations into the night as undergraduates, talking about life, the universe, and everything. So that's one answer. The second answer is death. So I asked myself the question, what happens at physical death? Does nothing happen? Is it the end? Or is there some form of transition to another form of consciousness? So those are the two areas. So one is more existential, about how one lives and taking responsibility for one's choices. And the other is more metaphysical. What is consciousness? What is the relationship between consciousness and the brain? What is the nature of death?
Yeah, big questions. And you mentioned there this idea of philosophy being part of the sciences. And, I love the fact that physics used to be called natural philosophy, this idea
Indeed.
of the deep nature of things. Oh, thank you for that. So, David, before we come on to your books and your life's work promoting a post-materialist worldview, I want to pull apart some of the claims of Rupert's book, perhaps trying to play a little devil's advocate, to try and put ourselves in the position of a huge majority of the general public that have this materialist worldview, to better understand the deep resistance to post-materialist science in the mainstream. And perhaps, David, knowing Rupert's work so well, and many of the peer-reviewed studies that support his views, you can expand a little on each claim and give some examples. We won't be covering all of them, not least because we're not specialists, but also because there are so many. And I'll do my best to sort of throw back the skeptical arguments for us to discuss. First, I'm just going to read them out so people can get a sort of sense of this, of the things that were presented in Rupert's book and also in his TED Talk. So nature is mechanical and machine-like is the first. Second is matter is unconscious. The universe is unconscious. The third, the laws of nature are fixed and they haven't changed at all since the beginning of time. 4, the total amount of matter and energy has always been the same, except at the moment of the Big Bang. 5th, nature is purposeless and the evolutionary process has no purpose or direction other than self-perpetuation. 6, biological heredity is material. 7, memories are stored inside your brain as material traces. 8, your mind is inside your head. Your consciousness is correlated to the activity in your brain. 9, psychic phenomena and telepathy are impossible. And 10, mechanistic medicine is the only kind that really works. Now, let's jump straight in with the first one, David. Nature is mechanical and machine-like. Plants and animals are like machines, and we are lumbering robots, as Richard Dawkins puts it, and that our brains are like genetically programmed computers. What do you think of this machine analogy? Do you think it's an accurate assumption?
Well, the thing is that you've just said it yourself. It is an analogy. It is a metaphor. And so if you look back to the Hermetic Renaissance, because all of this is historically conditioned. If you look back to the time of Bruno, for instance, around 1600, then one of the important aspects there was the idea of the anima mundi, the soul of the world. So this was in contradiction to the machine view that everything is unconscious, that there was something animate which animated the whole world. That's why it's called the anima mundi, the soul of the world. And this was also resisted by the church at the same time as the rise of the mechanical philosophy in the 17th century. And there was a fascination in that time with mechanical contrivances. And so during the 18th century, and Voltaire talked about it in ironic terms. He said one of the wonders, the French achievement is the shitting duck, he said. So this was a mechanical duck that you could put food in, and it had wheels and things going on inside, so that it could crank something else out at the other end. And so people were fascinated by automata, by simulation, by something that could be mistaken. I mean, not obviously by today's standards, but could be mistaken for a machine. Then the second point, which is an important one generally as well, is that there was a distinction made by Galileo, Descartes, and others between primary and secondary qualities. So a primary quality was defined as something that you could weigh, see, touch, measure, in other words, quantitative and physical in that sense. And a secondary quality was all the subjective aspect of the human being. Our sense of taste, our smell, qualia, if you like, what the qualitative sense of consciousness and being alive.
And we can't really study psychology, for example, without dipping a hat to that, can we?
No, but I think the important thing is this primacy, you see, that if you call some aspect of nature primary and another secondary, and then what you're going to tend to do is to explain the second in terms of the first. So in this case, the idea is that mind then, so the matter gives rise to mind. We'll come on to that in more detail in a moment. And then what you were also trying to do is to remove the human being from the equation. So if you look, for instance, at the very classical mechanical experiments by Galileo, dropping weights off the side of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, then you've got something which is reproducible anywhere by anybody, and there's no subjective element that could kind of get in the way of the laws of mechanics and acceleration and motion and so on. And then with gradually over the next 200 years, you get the development of more and more sophisticated machines and calculating machines in the first place, and then further mechanical contrivances, the whole industrial revolution, mechanization, and then the computer, which is obviously a key analogy. I mean, 100 years ago, people were talking about telephone exchanges, and so that was the main metaphor that was used. It's still a bit of a sort of mechanistic metaphor, and so now we're using machines, a machine analogy to explain the human. And Rupert calls this, he says, it's not anthropomorphic, it's mechanomorphic. In other words, you're explaining the human in terms of something that the humans themselves have invented. And so it's proved a very powerful metaphor. And if you're
we
asking,
tend to forget, don't we? That's the thing, is when it becomes so embedded in society, we forget that it's a metaphor at all. For example, the software hardware, separation for what you were just talking about sort of the solid physical and then the subjective mental. I think that's a brilliant analogy. It's really, really helpful to think of software and hardware, but it is an analogy.
It is an analogy. And in fact, the thing is that if you go deeper into this, you can't think without ideas and analogies. And so this is the way we actually understand things. And if you dig down into this, well, you think, well, what is a concept? Well, a concept etymologically is something that you grasp with. So it's literally, capere means to grasp. So you grasp with. And a percept is something you grasp through. So the whole idea of perception is grasping through. And the other analogy that we use a lot is seeing. I see what you mean. So a theory, literally, if you look at the etymology of theoria, it means to see. It's a way of seeing.
Mm.
So I think we need to drill down into the meaning of some of these words, even, as well as the analogies we use. And then you can
language
become
itself.
aware that everything is, that we're trading in language and metaphors as ways of grasping what we can't quite grasp.
And this idea, which I think is originally a Buddhist idea, of the mental construct, that the thing in my head is not the same as the thing that I'm trying to grasp. But we need to make sure that it's very, very clear that those aren't the same thing. And I think we forget.
Indeed, because we're using these means all the time. And when we're using language, we're using ideas, we're using concepts. And we have a common stock of concepts. And the meaning of these concepts is different depending on the culture you're in. And so if you take a very trivial example, bread is not the same as pain. French pain, you think, well, it's a long stick, whereas you say bread, it's something different. And so you immediately got these cultural connotations. And so the same applies to scientific concepts in terms of their reach and use within a larger metaphorical context.
And how's this analogy going to develop? I mean, we're on the brink of a transhumanist revolution that's going to take us out of the computer era into a sort of biotechnological era. Do you think that the analogy will change and we'll start to talk about things in a sort of biotechnological way?
Well, I think this is a really critical issue because what it addresses is the basic nature of the human being. So, as you've been saying, that if you view the human being as a biological machine, fundamentally, because you are using and extending this analogy of the machine, or a biochemical machine, or a biotechnological machine, then the machine can then be, the functions of the machine can be enhanced by various means, which is what the plan is in terms of enhancement. And that then takes you down a particular route, which is very much the World Economic Forum route, as you're probably aware. And it's the route that is envisaged by Ray Kurzweil, with his singularity coming up in 25 years' time. But then you have to ask yourself the question: is this actually is the metaphor of the biological machine completely adequate? I mean, obviously, you could see that up to a certain point, as with any analogy and metaphorical system, it's useful. It's very useful. It actually illuminates things. But then every idea has its own limitation. And so in the same way that it illuminates something, it also obscures other aspects. And so the aspect that is obscured for me is precisely this subject and depth and qualitative aspect to the human being, which you can't actually quantify. And so the analogy, the danger is that we run away, we allow the analogy to run away with us, and we forget our humanity. And what is the essence of a human? That's the question that I think we have to ask ourselves very profoundly, and have extensive debate about this.
And that brings us directly onto the second point, which is this idea that matter is unconscious and that the universe is unconscious. The starting point for me here, I think, is this wonderful quotes from people like Max Planck and Schrödinger from the early 20th century, where they came across this data and they just were like, we can't get past this. Just consciousness is utterly
fundamental,
integrated in this system of measurement, and we have no way of getting behind it and trying to understand the physical world without talking about consciousness. What are your thoughts on this? Can we separate the two? I think it's absurd to try.
Yes, well, again, this is a very deep question to look into. I mean, let's just go back for a moment to this primary and secondary qualities, because I think that's the root of the way that people are now thinking about these things, is that if matter gives rise to mind and brains give rise to consciousness,
Emergence, isn't it, is the word?
yes, nature is effectively, matter is unconscious, because you can't actually get one out of the other, or else you have to come up with another view, which is that somehow, like as T.H. Huxley said, it's like steam coming out of a kettle. There is a byproduct which is consciousness, but then you have to dispense with agency and free will, and that becomes philosophically problematic. We might get onto that in a moment. But I think what's happening now is actually very interesting, because there are some philosophers like Philip Goff, for instance, and also Christoph Koch, who've moved away from a hard physicalism, materialism. And I analyzed a lot of these positions in my original book, Survival, in the first part. And they're realizing, rather along the lines that you've been talking about with Planck, that there's something irreducible about consciousness. And in fact, if you just take the example of our conversation now, obviously we have to both be conscious in order for any conversation to take part. And also we are trying to convey structural messages, by language and concepts, in terms of conveying understanding and understanding each other, understanding questions, and then understanding the answers and building the dialogue. And so, in that sense, the consciousness becomes the prerequisite for any knowing. And I think it's the means of knowing, in fact. And so that's what I think. I've been thinking about this recently, and that's what I think Planck was getting at when he said you can't get behind consciousness. And so I think that there's a lot of shifting and redefining going on here, within philosophy, quite actually apart from relationship to our lived experience. It's just conceptual. So Galen Strawson is another example of somebody who's moved in this direction, and he says that we'll look back on the idea that consciousness was illusory with amazement, when we sort of, 20, 30, 50 years' time, writing up the history of the last 100 years.
Well, I love his point about this sort of the real issue that we have, because we're so steeped in this idea of evolution, that we have this idea of the sort of very simple building blocks of the universe slowly developing in complexity. But Strawson sort of says there's this moment where suddenly consciousness comes out of non-consciousness. That moment still needs to be accounted for. And I think the panpsychist approach that says, listen, there was some part of those original building blocks that had some seed of consciousness, even in a very, very simple form, that could then evolve into a more complex consciousness, makes more sense than just saying magically, basically by saying that it's emerged out of nothing, you're basically saying magic is real. What's your take on Strawson's argument? I think it's very solid.
Yes, well, I suppose there's an irreducible mystery at the bottom of this, whichever way you look at it, because in a sense, you take there's one mystery is replaced by another, and in terms of sentience, and there's stones than sentience, and I think I probably go more with Whitehead here, because what Whitehead's idea was encompassed in what he called pan-experientialism. And he was writing about the same time as Planck gave that famous interview. So Process and Reality came out in 1928, and the Observer interview was 1931. And Whitehead was one of the people who, as a philosopher and mathematician, and he understood the implications of the emerging physics, both in relativity and quantum theory. And so his take was that that's where we have to start from. We have to start from experience rather than starting from, as it were, matter or mind. It's the wrong starting point, he says. And he writes Science in the Modern World, which is more some lectures he gave in Cambridge in the mid-1920s, came out in 1925. But the point I wanted to arrive at here is that the way Whitehead looks at evolution in relation to God, he says that there are two aspects. There is a transcendent aspect, which is recognizable in theology and theological tradition, and that God is beyond everything. And then there's the immanent aspect, which is that God is within. And it's the immanent aspect which we're looking at in terms of emergence and evolution. But so he would say that the transcendent aspect of existence is always there, underlying the emergent process of evolution. So that's a slightly different framing of the same idea that
Perhaps less
consciousness.
controversial, the panpsychism approach, because it's slightly less calling on a transcendent concept. What do you think of integrated information theory, which is trying to actually give a mathematical basis for all of this? Do you think that trying to put maths into this equation is just foolish? Is it naive, or do you think that they're onto something, Tononi and the?
Well, I don't actually know much about that field, but I think it's an extension of the scientific method. And when Galileo said the language of nature is mathematics, and so mathematics and science obviously go very closely together, but you're still talking about the quantitative aspect of existence.
Yeah, I still think that it is the right approach. And there's another wonderful man, Hoffman, who I'm hoping to interview, who, alongside some physicists working on entanglement, are looking to create a mathematical theory of consciousness as well. And I think, in a way, for me personally, just the fact that they're trying to do this and the fact that they're using it as a support for panpsychist views, I think, as you said, it's a sort of normalization of these theories of consciousness. It's trying to encourage the scientific community to see this as a nuts and bolts possibility rather than some woo-woo transcendent reality.
Right. What is it actually explaining, though? That would be my question, because I can see that in terms of a formalism and a structure and a way of seeing and understanding, it could be incredibly useful. But in terms of lived experience, I can't see that that's going to add very much to the quality of our lives.
Well, absolutely. But I think, for me, what is important is that this idea of the presence of the seeds of consciousness within, testable physical reality, I think is a great step in the right direction. So, I'm always open to these approaches.
Do you think, though, that it's still trying to build up the whole from the parts? Because obviously, again, there are two ways. A holism and reductionism, in my view, are complementary. That one doesn't get a whole understanding of things or a complete understanding without actually coming from the top down and going from the bottom up.
Well, this is a very good point. If you don't have access to all of the information in of every single element and dimension of existence, you can't actually do that. We're always working from a relativized point of view, and we'll come back to that, because obviously there is another of the assumptions later on. Okay, next one, David. The laws of nature are fixed. They haven't changed since the beginning of time. The constants of nature are also fixed, hence the name constants. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, that's not so much my area, but I think there's one point I'd like to add or make at this point, because I have discussed this with Rupert, and that is that I think his argument is that if we now have a completely evolutionary universe with the Big Bang and the whole process following on from that, then isn't it possible, he's really asking the question, that the laws of nature could also evolve and resemble more habits than actual laws. So again, you see, the law of nature is another metaphor. And so we have to remember, and that originally came from the law-like attributes of God that were discussed by theologians. And what you're really talking about here are regularities in nature. So a law of nature is a description of a regularity, whereas a law in terms of a statute is something that lays down a rule or lays something out which you're meant to obey. And so there is a bit of, one needs to again drill down a bit into how the term law is used there. And historically, again, it tended to be associated with determinism. And so we're going back to this mechanistic idea, the Laplace idea, which has been overtaken by complexity, in my view, of a sort of old linear mechanical causality of one thing following on another, which is obviously a simplification. So the law, again, the point is that the notion of law is another metaphor.
And yet, there's a rather nice extension of that metaphor, which is, of course, that our laws change over time. We adapt our laws based on discovering whether they're working well and whether they're actually being satisfied or not. Interesting.
Very true.
Some of the pushback on Rupert, for example, from physicist Sean Carroll, who's a proponent of the theory of the many worlds interpretation from quantum physics. He pushed back on Rupert here and said, well, actually, many respectable scientists who study the possibility that physical parameters vary with time, both theoretically and experimentally. So he's saying, actually, scientists are a bit more open than you're giving them credit for. And of course, there is a lot of experimental physics out there looking into this, and that there are margins of error. And that obviously experimental techniques are updating every year. Rupert refers to the speed of light being measured differently sometime in the 1930s and the 1940s, and those measurements have been sort of conveniently brushed under the carpet in order to try and make out that it is a constant. But Sean Carroll's pushing back on that, saying, listen, we are very much aware that there are margins for error. But maybe this is more of a conceptual question, because actually this is a mathematical problem, that we need to establish those as constants, because otherwise we struggle to measure the data that we're actually looking to explore in the experiment. It's like you can't have too many variables, or otherwise the experiment isn't a closed system, and we can't actually make any conclusions. Maybe we just have to accept that we need to make a few assumptions and pretend that a few things are constant, at least to a sort of estimation, in order to get any decent data. What do you think about that? Is this just par for the course? We just have to accept that we need to make a few estimations?
Well, I think there are two different points there. One is that if you look at the variations in the measurement of the speed of light, they're infinitesimally small as a percentage. And so for practical purposes, I don't think it's going to make a huge amount of difference. The other more general point, and this is really explained in great detail by the work of Nicholas Maxwell, is that you can't actually, and R.G. Collingwood that we might come on to, but you can't do anything in terms of an intellectual pursuit without assumptions. And so, for instance, one basic assumption that Nicholas talks about is unity. It's you infer that everything is a unity, and therefore you can assume that. And for all practical purposes, that's absolutely correct. And one doesn't need to revisit it. But the point is, there's a whole architecture here which underlies the way that people go about particular disciplines in science. There has to be. I mean, there are correct experimental procedures, and there are correct setups, and all of this. And so I think it's largely a question of remaining aware of the larger context in which you are operating, which is a social context, a historical context, a scientific context. There are all sorts of
Do you think
different layers.
scientists are guilty of perhaps overstating their case and not being enough aware of that, or do you think there is a bit of humbleness about?
Well, I think the structural issue, which is actually an educational one, is that science is not taught alongside philosophy of science and history of science, and so majority of scientists actually don't know very much about the history and philosophy of science, which actually contextualizes their work. So this is one of, if you look at the influence of Karl Popper and then Thomas Kuhn and the structure of scientific revolutions, what they were trying to do was to make scientists more aware of the underpinnings of what they were doing. And so I do think that that's something which obviously we're looking at in some detail in the Galileo Commission and with the Galileo Commission report.
Tell us a bit about that, David, because that's a fascinating new project of yours.
Yes, indeed. Well, the reason it's called the Galileo Commission is that it's an invitation to look through the telescope at the large evidence base in what Dean Radin calls advanced science of consciousness. And obviously, it's a slightly controversial way of putting it. And in the same way that the professor of philosophy at Padua refused to look through Galileo's telescope because he already knew that it was impossible what was being claimed by Galileo, because how did he know that? On authority. Whose authority? Aristotle. And so you've then got this question of authority and respectability and credibility and acceptability coming in, which is the whole social context of science. And indeed, it's the whole social context of us as human beings. We have two complementary modes, if you like. We want to stand out and we want to fit in. And to the extent we stand out, we want to be original and so on. But fitting in, we need to have our peer group, accept and approve of us.
Identity is right at the center of this as well, isn't it? Because if our beliefs are challenged by new data, actually we have to also redefine our identity, because we define our identity based on our beliefs. And I think this could be a lot of the source of the resistance in there. Well, people do go and check out the Galileo Commission. It has already published its first report, and there is some extraordinary evidence in there from real, solid, repeatable science that will certainly put a few things in stark contrast with what we were taught at school, as it were. Coming back to the fixed nature of constants, I just wanted to also mention, first of all, the theory of relativity, which, as we know, completely revolutionized cosmology and science as we know it, because it was clear that space and time are not linear. And we're going to be covering this on the show. And I think I wanted to get your opinion on this, David. I just think that the implications of that have not yet been absorbed into our everyday society, where, to all intents and purposes, our senses tell us that space and time are constant and straight and linear. And so we don't really worry about the scientific implications of that for our worldview. What's your take on this?
Well, I think that's true of physics in general. And it's as true of quantum theories. It is a relativity theory.
Absolutely. I was just going one at a time.
It takes a long time for the culture to catch up with the implications, the revolutionary implications of scientific and other discoveries. I mean, some things can come, are accepted much more quickly. I mean, an example recently would be epigenetics. So it's just in the last 10 or 15 years that the importance of epigenetics has emerged, and that has then modulated the sort of neurogenetic determinism idea that everything is already pre-wired, rather than the expression of genes depending on your lifestyle, your decisions, and their outer conditions. So the whole, I think the general direction of travel is towards a more complex and subtle understanding of things. But there's a kind of time lag there that we need, in some ways, I think we need to catch up quite quickly with, because one of the crucial insights for me is that if there is a unity underpinning, both in physics and ecology and consciousness, then that overcomes the idea that we're fundamentally separate from each other, and that we should be pursuing our own interests at the expense of others, whether nationally or individually, when the challenges of the planet are such that our interconnectedness and our interdependence then has to become primary. And I see this as a very strong message particularly from quantum theory.
Absolutely, and that's something we're covering on the show. We're really going into the non-duality suggested by entanglement as a phenomena. Do check out our show on entanglement with Chris Fields for that. And I think, again, the way those implications sort of trickle down is very individual. Each of us has our own personal reaction to that. And Chasing Consciousness listeners is really hoping to be sending that out. So please do share these shows if you feel that this is a valuable message for friends who, like us, may be sort of on the fence, looking for rational explanations, but feeling that something's missing from this purely separate, physical, non-conscious way of understanding the world. Just before we move on, I just wanted to quickly mention another sort of relative idea. Carlo Rovelli, physicist, is releasing a new book about the relative nature of things. And basically, as far as I understand, he's talking about the fact that we really can't talk about anything except by talking about something else. But that thing's reality is only in relation to another thing. So all things exist in relation to each other, but nothing exists in and of itself. That would be one of the implications of the theory of relativity. That, if I understand correctly, is what Carlo's book is about. It's coming out just this year in 2020. But for me, when I heard this from his publisher, I was like, wait a minute, this is the Buddhist theory of dependent origination.
Yes.
Which is that you cannot speak about one thing causing another without a philosophical eternal regress back to everything else that is interconnected with it. So it comes back to your point of interconnectedness, and it's something we're going to be really going into depth on the show. Anything to add on that, David?
Yes, absolutely. I recently had a trialogue with Apilla, Colorado, and Leroy Littlebear, who are both it's one of my imaginal inspirations, and also from the Scientific and Medical Network. And they said that a fundamental postulate of indigenous science is that reality is relational, not relative, but relational.
What's the difference?
And so, everything is related to everything else rather than everything being relative. And so you've got this web of life. There's another analogy. This Indra's net, the web of life, these that you can't make an adjustment in one or impact in one area without it resonating through the whole system. And that to me is what we need to understand as a species, as a sort of evolutionary jump, so that we can actually address these things together, but in a systems way, not in a way that's going to result in the domination of one set of people over others.
Interesting. Wow, we'll definitely be linking to your new podcast in the show notes. So do go and check that out. Can you just repeat those names because they're so beautiful? Who are those two people?
Oh, Apilla, Colorado, who founded the Worldwide Indigenous Science Network. That's WISN.org. And Leroy Littlebear, who's a professor in a Canadian university.
Fantastic. Love those indigenous names. Right, moving on. The total amount of energy and matter has always been the same. except at the moment of the Big Bang, when it all magically sprang into existence from nothing in a single instant. There was quite a giggle in the audience when Rupert suggested this idea at the TED Talk. It does sound a bit absurd when you put it like that. Just suddenly sprang into existence in an instant and then remained exactly the same quantity of matter and energy for the rest of time. What do you think about that?
Well, I think you really need to get the sort of physicist, cosmologist to comment on that one. That's that's not really something that I can really add any constructive comment about.
Well, thank you for your humility there, David. I myself feel totally unqualified to talk about this, but we are speaking about this with all of our interviews with physicists, trying to get a sense of really what is the correct interpretation of what we're getting through this experimental data. However, I did just want to add here that it's becoming very mainstream now to talk about dimensions in physics. I think some physicists are now talking of around 9 and potentially even up to 12 other dimensions. And it struck me that if we're looking at the universe as a single dimension, this idea that that dimension might be expanding or contracting, or that dimension may also have bleeds between each other. I don't see any reason why we would assume that those dimensions are completely watertight, as it were. Why should we assume that there isn't a bleed between them in some shape or form? But of course, that's pure speculation.
Could I just come in there?
Good, David. Yeah, he's got a thought.
With just an observation, and that's that my friend Bernard Carr, who's a cosmologist and he's president of the Scientific and Medical Network, he has developed what he calls a hyperspatial model, which integrates physics, cosmology, and consciousness. And so the general point I wanted to make is that it seems to be quite kosher to expand the number of dimensions in physics. But if you start saying, well, we need to expand the number of dimensions in relation to consciousness, then that's a no-go area. So I think that the notion of dimensions, of course, a dimension is something, again, it's measurable in principle. That's the origin of the word. But I think we just need a little bit of an expansion there to question whether we also need to be looking not just at dimensions of space-time or within space-time, but also dimensions of consciousness. And we know from our own experience that our state of consciousness will influence how we understand things.
And I'm sure you'd agree, David, that luckily this huge resurgence in consciousness studies that we've been seeing since the late 90s has really opened up that discussion. And now it's far less controversial for physicists to start speaking about these, as you said, these sort of mental imagined dimensions or consciousness-based dimensions. Moving on. Nature is purposeless. The evolutionary process has no purpose or direction other than self-perpetuation. What do you think, David?
Well, here's another big metaphysical one. Because again, the context of this arising is Western science arose from the Greek heritage, Greek philosophy and science, and Plato and Aristotle, but also from Christianity. And so the idea of purpose and purposelessness is something that is particular to Western ways of thinking. Now, the root of this is the kind of contraction of Aristotle's ideas of causality, and so he had what we called final cause. So there's a telos, there's a goal towards which things are unfolding. So you can see this in terms of acorn and oak tree. That's the unfolding of the acorn. The purpose of that, inverted commas, is to turn into an oak tree and produce more acorns, which is the self-perpetuation idea. And then there was a goal within the Christian cosmology of getting to heaven. So that was the purpose. It was to. So with evolution, you've then got this idea of humans being part of the natural world. And this was the big impact of of Darwin and Huxley in the 19th century. But one also has to remember that there was an alternative view even then, put forward by Alfred Russel Wallace, who was the co-founder of natural selection. And so the original paper given in 1858 at the Linnean Society was a joint paper by Darwin and Wallace. Wallace was in Sumatra, so he couldn't sort of fly in as one would these days.
Yeah.
So Wallace believed in spiritual evolution as well as physical evolution. And then this comes to the question is the whole process purposeless and has no direction? Well, I don't think so. I share Irving Laszlo's view and view quite a number of other people who say that there is an evolution towards complexity and consciousness. And that I think makes sense in terms of the overall evolutionary story. You could still try to maintain that. Well, that doesn't really amount to anything in terms of a purpose. But I think that it also means that our understanding of life and where we are in reality is becoming more complex and subtle and deep. And that itself, so there is a purpose in knowledge, if you like, by the enhancement of understanding. And this applies in our own lives through the evolution of the complexity and depth and unifying capacity of our own consciousness. And so I think it's a metaphysical statement, as it were. I think it's a way of making sure you keep God firmly out of the equation.
I mean, the Darwin, this is a very good reason why I think it's the National Society, is it the Royal Society basically excluded Wallace from the whole achievement of the theory of evolution, was possibly for this slightly difficult to manage transformational element that he wanted to introduce into the theory. But it's definitely, I think, without spending too much time on this, because of our difficulty of finding any scientific nature, I think it is a massive assumption. We cannot say much more than what we see in the physical world, that yes, self-perpetuation, the continuation of one species is very clearly visible as a purpose. And we can't establish for sure anything else. And it's very personal. It's part of the subjective experience of the individual, what that purpose may be. But I think to assume that that's it, just because it's scientifically convenient, seems to me a little bit reductionalist. Okay, moving through the rest of these assumptions, biological heredity is material. Everything you inherit in your genes is in your genes, or in epigenetic modifications, or in cytoplasmic inheritance. It's material. Obviously, we're referring here, Rupert's referring here to his extremely controversial theory of morphic resonance, which sort of takes the possibility of change beyond your material genes and epigenetic changes. We're going to be talking to Rupert about that in detail. Is there something you'd like to mention quickly, David, that might throw this into contrast? I think it's a big conversation.
Yes, well, I think, and it also relates to the memory question,
which is the next one, which I might just treat with them at the same time. Memories are stored inside your brain as material traces, modified nerve endings, phosphorylated proteins. We don't know how it works, but everyone assumes it must be in the brain. These two do come slightly together.
Yeah, so I think I think to all intents and purposes, the first assumption is broadly true. But the question is whether it's 90% true or 85%. But the evidence that I think is the most interesting evidence, and it's robust in the sense that there is physical evidence for it, is the work of Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia, the Division of Perceptual Studies. And this comes from 2,500 plus cases analyzed in great detail. And the point here is that there's a correlation between memories and birthmarks. And this is the really interesting and intriguing. And so it's really just raise it for intriguing purposes and say, well, what does this say, or what might it say? So just give you a case history, illustrative case history. So a man, a child remembers a life where the man died through gunshot wound through the head, and there was a corresponding birthmark with the entry and exit wound on the side of the head. And the memories of this event, and indeed of quite a number of life events, were able to be verified by Stevenson. But in particular, the man, there were his hospital records of the man with exact illustrations of where the bullet had gone in and out. And so this means there's a factual basis which links the memory with the birthmark. So the question is, what might be the mechanism for such a development? And this is where you come back to Aristotle's idea of the soul as a field. And this is obviously relates to Rupert's work on morphogenetic fields and morphic fields generally. So that if you're to try and make any kind of rational connection between the mode of death and the birthmark, which statistically, if you map all the in sort of 2 centimeter square pieces, and you then work out the probability of it being precisely those points which correspond to the entry and exit wound of the bullet.
And this is quite famous in the Tibetan tradition, isn't it? Because they go off and find the new Lama, the new Dalai Lama, based on the idea of reincarnation. And in fact, there is actually quite a robust field of reincarnation studies, which certainly, maybe not right away, but in the 3rd or the 4th series of Chasing Consciousness, we'll be getting onto this. So anybody who's interested, and we'll definitely be linking this in the show notes as well, David. So if you can furnish us with this research.
Yes, it's a Department of Perceptual Studies at University of Virginia, and we're in close touch with the researchers there. And it's being continued by Professor Jim Tucker. So point of departure for reflection, just wondering what the implications of this might be, and the implications of, one of the bits of work that Rupert looked at was Driesch's experiments, which I was actually just reading about again last night in a book by Michael Polanyi, of the self-regenerating body parts in certain animals, but not obviously so much in humans. And so what is it that enables that to happen? And so can the whole thing be explained by genes, or do we also need a field? So that's really
the electric body theory. Yeah, I'm really definitely.
Which I think it's a very open question, and one that I can't really say much more about.
Just that it is a compelling idea, isn't it? Especially now that we're with quantum theory, there's this this talk of a sort of a quantum field. It seems to be entering more into the scientific part, this understanding that a field may be more feasible as an explanation for actual physical reality. Okay.
Well, I think that even goes right back to the 19th century, because I've just been reviewing a book called Einstein on Einstein. And part of the discussion was about 19th century mechanics and how the mechanics idea mutated into the field, and how the field has then become a hugely important conceptual tool to order our knowledge. And so I think that there may well be fields that we don't yet know enough about that could have explanatory power.
Absolutely. It's certainly a very, very useful way of thinking about things, isn't it? Okay, memories, anything to mention about this? I mean, obviously that is something we're going to be covering the neuroscience of, because there's a lot of very, very contrasting theories on this. Anything you'd like to mention about the way memories work?
Well, if you just reflect on the Stevenson research, and even Carl Sagan said that this needs to be taken seriously.
Oh, really? Sagan admitted that this was a real phenomenon. God, that's
he said this is a kind of cloud on the materialistic horizon, if you like, that needs to be taken seriously.
Because usually he was quite against all of this, wasn't he?
Oh, I know, it was very robust. So the question is, with these, if children remember previous lives, what you can certainly say is that these memories are not in the brain of the child who remembers them, because they can't have been. They can't have been laid down in the way that we might, analogically think about memories in our own case. And so they obviously must be getting the memories from somewhere, retrieving the memories from somewhere else. I think this is all very open. I just think that that we need to expand our ideas in order to accommodate this kind of evidence. And I don't know the answer. I don't know what the ultimate theory of memory might be. But I mean, it also relates to any kind of communications from other dimensions. But I know we don't want to go into it at the moment. But I think the advantage of the Stevenson work is that it's very rigorously analyzed.
Yeah.
And all the, so Stevenson, you could say that this isn't actually any proof of reincarnation as such, or rebirth. It's actually a proof of survival of these memories in some other form.
Absolutely.
And again, we don't know enough to be able to draw any firm conclusions. But what we can infer from this is that there's more to memory than brain traces.
Absolutely. Your mind is inside your head, number 8. Your consciousness is correlated to your brain activity. Now, obviously, this is something we're covering in detail on the show. We're looking at, equally, we're looking at very, very reductive theories, including that free will is a complete illusion, that this is all brain chemistry, right up to extended consciousness theories. What's your position on this, David?
Well, Rupert uses the phrase extended mind, which I think is quite a good one. So the non-extended mind would be the idea that it's all inside the brain. And the extended mind is that somehow that the mind extends beyond, which is one of the reasons why he's interested in telepathy, animal telepathy, and staring experiments. But because these provide some traction, if you like, in terms of which you can look at the ideas. But I suppose the fundamental point here is that if you go back to William James's Ingersoll lecture on immortality, which was published in 1898, he and an Oxford philosophy don called F.C.S.Schiller and Henri Bergson were all looking at the idea that the brain was a kind of filter or transducer of consciousness. And James put the matter very, very clearly, and Ian McGilchrist is writing about this at the moment. He said that we know that there's a relationship between consciousness and the brain, but we don't know the nature of that relationship. It's assumed, and still is, that the brain produces or generates consciousness. Hence the hard problem: how does the brain generate consciousness? Which contains that presupposition in it. But equally, you can explain the evidence by presupposing that the brain in some way acts as a filter or transducer or permitter or transmitter of consciousness. And this philosophical argument, along with the evidence, has been developed in detail by the University of Virginia books, which are Irreducible Mind, Beyond Physicalism, and then coming out in April this year, Consciousness Unbound, which is the third in the series. And these are the most rigorous available texts, showing that James and Myers as well, Frederic Myers, because he had similar ideas, were probably onto something. But we've got kind of diverted down this path, which for most purposes is extremely productive, of the assumption that the brain generates consciousness, but there's too much other evidence, what you might call evidence-based spirituality. There's a big evidence base which calls that into question, which is really what the Galileo report is raising. And it's why we are asking people to look through the telescope.
And I do encourage listeners to check our episode with Ian McGilchrist about all of this, where we'll be going into all of this and talking about his new book. But also, David, thank you for drawing our attention to the University of Virginia's work on this and these important books. We'll definitely be linking all of that, and I'll be trying to get some of these people, these researchers, onto the show. I'm aware we're coming up to the hour, David, so I just want to come through. There's more to say on all of these points, isn't there? They're all juicy conversations in and of themselves. But let's just get through these last few points. Now, number 9, psychic phenomena, as you mentioned, something that that Rupert has done a lot of research on. Psychic phenomena like telepathy are impossible. Your thoughts and intentions cannot have any effects at a distance because your mind is in your head. Referring, of course, to the previous assumption. Therefore, all the apparent evidence for such phenomena is illusory. People believing such things either don't understand statistics or are deceived by coincidences or are victims of wishful thinking. How do you explain, in the light of the, in my opinion, I mean, I'm very new to this field, David, but there really is an enormous body of scientific research from, I think, probably the more solid repeatable stuff is in the last sort of 60, 70 years, although the field does spread right back to the beginning of the 20th century and the end of the 1800s. I think this goes a long way to explain the resistance to this, doesn't it? This idea that really we just can't imagine the implications of the fact that this might be outside, that might be able to stretch outside of our heads.
Yes, I agree that the assumption we're talking about now is a direct logical consequence of the previous one, that the mind is in the brain, and the brain produces consciousness. Therefore, consciousness can't be non-local. So any kind of non-local effects that seem to be happening, like telepathy and so on, are impossible in principle. So I think the one exchange that's gone on recently is that in 2018, there's a paper from Etzel Cardenia from Lund University, which is a sort of meta-analysis overview of the whole ESP-Psi research over the last 70 years, including the meta-analyses. And then this was...
sorry, just for listeners new to this field, what do you mean by meta-analyses?
Well, this is where you aggregate studies to work out the overall probability of in relation to the whole collection of studies.
But point of the scientific collective approach is that we aggregate all of these studies to get a consensus approach. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So what then happened was that there was a so-called rebuttal of this by Raber and Alcock, which was published by the editor of this psychological journal. I can't exactly remember. I can let you know the reference. And then the matter was left to rest there, in spite of Etzel Cardenia objecting to the rather inadequate response. But it comes back to the point you made, which is that because these things are impossible, these phenomena are impossible, we don't actually need to pay any attention to them. Now, what I'd like to do here is actually make rather an important distinction, because if you go back to 1882 and the foundation of the Society for Psychical Research, this was known as psychical research. So you were researching into the psyche, you were researching into consciousness, what we now call consciousness research, sort of wider consciousness research. And this was based on people's experiences. And so, for instance, in 1886, there was a phenomenal book came out called Phantasms and the Living by Gurney, Myers, and Podmore, which I read a long time ago, 1,200 pages. And these are people who are fellows at Trinity College, Cambridge, and not stupid, you know. They looked into these phenomena in great detail. So the first question is, are such experiences possible? Now, you actually have to answer an emphatic yes, because people report them all the time. And so you can't have an impossible experience. I mean, let's just take deathbed apparitions. Somebody has an apparition of somebody and it coincides more or less exactly to the time of death of that person. And that's something they looked at in 1886. Now, the second question is, can these experiences, or can this faculty or these phenomena be reproduced in the laboratory? Now, that's a different question. And so what the skeptics often say is that because this is unsatisfactory in the laboratory, you can then say, well, psi doesn't exist. People do not have these experiences. And so I think one needs to distinguish sharply between these two areas. One, you can't deny that people have extraordinary experiences, but you can say, well, these are very difficult to reproduce in the lab. Near-death experiences are now universally acknowledged to happen, but can you get verifiable proof of the out-of-body component? We don't know.
Absolutely, and that's something we'll be going into in depth in further series of Chasing Consciousness, is just to see if we can actually glean any scientifically valid data from these investigations. There's another point here as well, David, which is about the limits of science, and we're going to be coming back in part 2 to really talk about that, particularly with regard to the scientific or medical network, which is looking to bridge these areas, sort of perhaps bridging across an area of verifiable scientific fact. But there's another point I wanted to bring up here, which is this thing that it seems so completely against scientific endeavor. Like, the whole point of scientific endeavor is we must look at the data. We must go into detail of what is being observed by the public. That will then call scientists in to look into more rigorous detail. And if that data contradicts our previous beliefs and theories of reality, we are obliged as good scientists to update our worldview. I feel that this, what you mentioned with the Galileo Commission, that he refused to look through the telescope. A lot of the rebuttals we're seeing, again, I'm totally new to this field. I myself was one of the many secularly educated people who presume that it was nonsense because it hasn't been covered in the mainstream press, that it was make-believe. But when I went to look at it, like some scientists, some physicists particularly that I've interviewed on this podcast, they came kicking and screaming. That was the phrase this lovely physicist used. He said, I came kicking and screaming to this data. And he took it straight back into the lab. It was like, right, I'm going to prove this wrong. And
well, it's difficult to prove things wrong.
And he couldn't. He said, I had to, after 5 years of literally being in an existential crisis as a physicist, I had to open my own scilab because I couldn't do this. I couldn't falsify this evidence. So I'll tell you huge respect for that kind of scientist who is willing to abandon 30, 40 years of worldview, 30, 40 years, based on hundreds of years of the history of science, forced to reestablish, to reevaluate their worldview. For me, this is honorable, it is humble, and is downright necessary for us to practice science. I mean, I'm sorry if I sound a little overpassionate about this, but
no, well,
I know how much pushback we're going to get.
I share that. Yeah, I share that sentiment.
Talking about this on the podcast, we're going to get so much pushback. I'm going to get insulted by all of my friends, saying, Freddie, don't be such a pseudo-scientific hippie. How can you, diddle with this make-believe? And I just feel an absolute obligation as a rationally minded person who's willing to take on board new data and face the difficult situation of having to completely readdress my identity because I have to change my beliefs. I just think it is a moral and ethical responsibility.
Well, what we're trying to do in the Galileo Commission is really to expand the acceptable evidence base, and the resistance to the evidence base comes from the assumptions that we talked about earlier on, and therefore the the limitations of what is possible in terms of those assumptions. And the late Larry Leshan wrote about this, and he said that there are no impossible experiences. And so if your theory is unable to account for the experiences, then so much the worse for your theory. You need to change your theory. And so that really what we're talking about here is how to balance open-mindedness and rigor. And so the true scientist should have a delicate balance between these two aspects, being open-minded, but also being critical and rigorous in terms of the assessment of whatever evidence it is that they're looking at. But you shouldn't say as a scientist that such evidence is impossible in principle. How can you make progress in science if you dismiss evidence in principle?
That is dogmatic. That is dogmatic.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
But let me tell you a story. Sir John Polkinghorne, who's a physicist, he was professor of physics at Cambridge, and then he became an Anglican priest, and he was master of Queen's College, Cambridge. I don't know him that well now, but I used to know him quite well. And he came to a seminar in the late 90s, and we gave him a copy of Dean Radin's book, The Conscious Universe, which is his first major book, because we had a spare copy of it. And after a few weeks, I had another conversation with him, and he said, well, the evidence was much better than I thought it would be. And that was a significant. Here's a major scientist, fellow of the Royal Society.
But would he go on the record to say that? That's the really difficult situation for scientists, and I have absolute respect for any scientist trying to make their living and trying to maintain a respectable reputation in a paradigm that quite simply has blocked with all of its force the reality of this phenomena and the science that is exploring it. And I have to say, with great humility, I don't want to attack any of those people, because I myself, until very, very recently, when I started to read this data, would have said the same thing. So I think it's really important, just to wrap it up, because we're coming up to the end of part one. I feel great compassion for anybody who is in a position that they really must just stick to these assumptions, because that is the paradigm in which they're working. That is the paradigm in which they're receiving the funding that allows them to, look after their families. I have total respect for that. But I believe that people like us, David, who are potentially slightly less vested in that worldview, we do have a bit of a duty to help the public to slowly open up this reality, because the implications are so important. And we're going to come back to that in part two to talk more about some of that.
I think a lot of people out there, maybe people who are listening to us, who are scientists, who are academics, find themselves in this invidious position where they have had an experience that goes beyond what can be understood and explained in purely materialistic terms. But they feel their colleagues would be incredibly skeptical, and they'd lose their credibility if they were to talk about the experience. They can maybe talk about it around a dinner table, but certainly not at a faculty meeting. And so we've got this strange situation of contradiction between lived experience and the situation in which the social and scientific situation in which people find themselves. And so how can we close that public-private gap and as it were, come out?
So I think there's a tipping point, isn't there? In all of these things, there's pressure, there's research, there's publicity, and it just slowly builds pressure. And eventually there's a tipping point, and it becomes permitted to start opening up. And the same thing happened with consciousness studies. In the 80s, consciousness studies was pariah stuff. It was like, you would never be recommended by a tutor to go into that in the 80s. And suddenly in the 90s, with David Chalmers and that conference that he set up in the mid 90s, suddenly it became extremely fashionable and actually quite respectable. So perhaps we're looking at that kind of change. David, I'd like to wrap up part one, because we're going to take a short break, and we're going to come back in part two. We're going to talk about your new books, your old books. We're going to talk about the limits of science. So really, what it's better not to include science in as a conversation, and what we're not expecting science to try and tackle because it's literally beyond its scope. We're going to try and work out if there's a little bit of a limit there. We're going to talk about your organization, the Scientific and Medical Network, that has been exploring and bridging these two worlds for such a long time. We're going to potentially try and work out some of the problems that we're seeing at the moment in New Age society, the New Age community, the wellness community, where they're drawing on scientific concepts without potentially a good solid base. We're going to see if there's some problems there. And we're going to talk about David's new book, The Quest for Wisdom, A Quest for Wisdom. David, thank you very much. We'll be back in a minute. Don't go away, listeners.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. This is part 2 of our episode about the assumptions of Western science with David Lorimer, author and director of the Scientific and Medical Network. So in the first part, listeners, do please go back. We went into detail, perhaps slightly more from the philosophical point of view rather than as practicing scientists, because David is more on the philosophy of science and the history of science side. We discussed all of these quite understandable assumptions of Western science. And we gave our point of view about why we think there needs to be potentially a little bit more flexibility and a little bit more open-mindedness. But above all, that to assume without looking at any data, just because it's inadmissible, because it's impossible, seems a little bit unscientific. Now, in the second part, this is part 2 of that, I want to go a little bit more into David's work. He's written many, many books, and also to the work of the Scientific and Medical Network. David, welcome back.
Thank you.
Let's move on to your 2001 book, Thinking Beyond the Brain. The consensus view in science in general is at best that consciousness emerges from our brain chemistry, but at worst is a complete illusion. Our job in this first series is to sort of bring the public up to date on other research, new data that potentially bites into that a little bit. What arguments does your book present that can support this call for a sort of wider science of consciousness beyond the reductive physicalist view?
Well, let me just sort of back up a bit in terms of the whole development of the field, because as you mentioned at the end of part 1, the consciousness studies took off, as it were, in the 1990s, with the establishment in 1994, for instance, of the Journal of Consciousness Studies. So Peter Fenwick, who's the emeritus president of the Scientific and Medical Network and a neuroscientist, neuropsychiatrist, when he was at Cambridge in the 1950s, he said you couldn't use the word. You could only use awareness. You couldn't use consciousness because it literally wasn't on the radar. And so in the 90s, this was beginning to be looked at more seriously. And in 1995, I founded with the Institute of Noetic Sciences a conference series, which has been going on ever since. Now we're doing it every year, called Beyond the Brain, which is beyondthebrain.org. That phrase comes from a book from Stan Grof, the Stanislav Grof, psychiatrist and pioneer in many different types of consciousness research. And so what we try to do in our Beyond the Brain conferences is to look at the latest evidence in the field, which points towards this wider science of consciousness, a wider and a deeper science of consciousness. And so the 2001 book brought together papers from the first 3 conferences, which are 95, 97, and 99, which we held at St. John's College, Cambridge, and attended by a capacity audience of 300 people, with many of the leading thinkers in the field. So really what we are looking at is what we call the further reaches of consciousness research, which is the exploration, if you like, of inner space. And so we're looking at the phenomena, some of which we've already mentioned. What is the nature of the near-death experience? Is there evidence for survival of consciousness? What's the status of this research into children who remember previous lives, apparitions, out-of-body experiences? So in other words, the experiences that people have, and also, to some extent, the laboratory studies. So we had a whole workshop with Dean Radin on Jamaica in 1999, and meditation is another area of interest. So we had Jim Austin, who's the author of Zen and the Brain. So we've had a lot of prominent researchers delivering lectures at our conferences. And so the book really presents some of these arguments. And I think we come back to this question that we were looking at in the first part, which is the relationship of brain and consciousness, and what the nature of that relationship is, and whether we need to think beyond the brain in order to understand the whole field. And so the argument of the volume and the argument of the series is that we do need to extend our ideas of consciousness beyond the brain.
And David, given the fact that this is a popular science podcast, and most of our listeners will be keen to read physical evidence, clear-cut proof for the existence of these phenomena as more than mere illusions of the mind, which of those things you've just mentioned do you think stands up best in actual lab tests? You mentioned Dean Radin's work at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, but there are psi labs all over the world. Which do you think stands up best? I mean, I always think of Schmidt's work on the random number generators as some of the most robust, but perhaps you've got some other ones to mention.
Well, there's that means there's a whole Princeton experimental anomalies research unit with Bob Jahn and Brenda Dunn. I mean that I think is very interesting work, but it's basically quantitative and statistical to see whether intention can have an effect on the outcome of random number generators. And so I think that's the effects are really statistical. It's a statistical result, but I don't think it has the same human interest as, for instance, the field of near-death experiences or even after-death communications. So there's only a limited areas that you can actually bring into the lab for repeatable experiments on telepathy, clairvoyance, remote viewing. I mean, there's a stack of papers written in each of these areas and books written, and I think just recently the most it hasn't come out yet. This is Bruce Grayson, and he's appeared. Some of your listeners may have seen this on the latest Netflix series on surviving death. There's the first episode, which is very good, is on near-death experiences.
Well, so I think you keep coming back to, David, we need to find a way within the scientific context to really take seriously and validate subjective experiences. And I think that I was hugely encouraged speaking with Joseph Ledoux, materialist neuroscientist, when he said that his great mission was to try and help the field understand that the emotion is not the same as the physiological process, and that actually we need to, when we're treating those kind of problems, whether let's take anxiety as a problem, that he said that there needs to be two things being treated. There, you're treating the physiological symptom, but you're also treating that state of mind, and they need to be treated separately. And his mentor, Mike Gazzaniga, in my interview with him, was saying, listen, the hard problem is the wrong question to be asking. I mean, of course, these subjective experiences are real. And you keep coming back to this point as well. We really need to find a way for science to to take this kind of data more seriously in a way, don't we?
Well, I think it's also a matter for the philosophy of science. I'm just reading at the moment the last book written by the chemist and philosopher of science, fellow of the Royal Society, Michael Polanyi, on what he calls the tacit dimension, and the tacit dimension is our immediate understanding, which Ian McGilchrist would say is mediated by the right hemisphere, as a result of which, or on top of which, or within which, we can then add this analytical dimension. But until you've got something to analyze, you can't really get started on that process. And so he shows quite logically that unless, and this is also the feeling side, and we also have to remember that we are, everything we say and perceive is not only through consciousness but also through the body. And so I'm speaking, as it were, from my body, and you are the same. And so that everything that we process through that, and this is Donald Hoffman's that's point of his new book, is in fact an interpretation, a bodily interpretation, an interpretation in relation to a particular frequency band, which we are able to perceive. And so I think we're moving. Tesla would have said this as well. I think we're moving more in the direction of a vibrational frequency model rather than a matter, sort of hard matter, as such.
Well,
so I think
that's a very easy concept to be hijacked by the New Age community and potentially distorted. And I think it's really, really useful to think about quantum theory here that talks about, this is neither a particle nor a wavelength. It's a quantum field. It's something in between. And I think if we look at that, that's very much accepted in mainstream physics, we have a much better chance of sort of getting away from some of these, I feel, and we'll come back to this in a minute, slightly unclear ideas that have been appropriated by the New Age. But that's potentially something you may differ from me on.
Can I just come back on that for a second? Because
please do.
I think another useful analogy from quantum complementarity would be that there is a particle aspect to the self, which is that sort of separation and distinctiveness. There's also a wave aspect which connects us to the whole field, and so you can't reduce one to the other.
Absolutely.
And so again, it's always a case not of contradicting things or reducing one thing to the other, but expanding your understanding to take in what might look on the face of it to be opposites.
And the cognitive neuroscience field led by Mike Gazzaniga that I just mentioned sees these as just different layers, and the way in which those layers interact can only be dealt with by adjacent layers. You cannot make the jump between two completely separate layers without a lot of very detailed information, which we just quite simply don't have at the moment.
Well, and also there are organizing principles at different levels. Another point made by Polanyi in his chapter on emergence. But if you look at making a speech as one of his examples, then you've got the words, the concepts, the sentences, and the style and the sort of affective impact, and each layer there has its own organizing principles, and the organizing principle of a word is not the same as that of the speech as a whole. So you can't reduce the speech to individual words. It wouldn't make any sense.
Absolutely. So McGilchrist makes this point about music as well, doesn't he?
He does. I mean, so you've got to get the right level of analysis when you're looking at these questions.
Tell us about the Scientific and Medical Network. What's the scope of this organization? It's been around for a long time, hasn't it?
It has. The network was founded in 1973 by four distinguished, as it happens, at the time they were men. George Blaker, a former civil servant in India and also worked at the Department of Education and Science at the time. Peter Leggett, who was a mathematician and Vice Chancellor of Surrey University. Sir Kelvin Spencer, who is former Chief Scientist at Ministry of Power, and Dr. Patrick Shackleton, who was the Dean of Postgraduate Studies at Southampton Medical School. And in fact, George and Patrick were brought together by a Polish priest called Andrew Glazewski, who knew both of them. And so the impulse for the network was really the same one we've been talking about, to widen and deepen science and to separate out the superstructure or ideology or belief system of scientism, which is a belief that all questions can be adequately responded to and answered by a reductive approach and a physicalist approach, and the scientific method of testing, experimentation, and splitting off, if you like, the assumptions informing science from the method of science itself.
So it's amazing that those professionals in the field, as long ago as 40 years ago, saw exactly the same issues that we're talking about today.
Well, indeed. And you see, what they wanted to do, and which is still true in our work, is to provide a safe space in which people could draw on the intuitive and the rational side of knowing, and see how these could be reconciled. And so what happened was that they had a initial meeting at the University of Exeter, where Kelvin Spencer had a senior sort of position, and out of this came the idea that they would write, all about a dozen people at the original meeting. They would all write to a few practicing scientists and doctors, and a few other disciplines, but mainly practicing scientists and doctors, to see whether they would be interested in joining an informal network. And one has to remember that in those days, the word network was not used at all.
No.
Now it's absolutely commonplace. And so the Scientific and Medical Network was actually one of the first organizations to call itself a network, because it implies a flat hierarchy of exchange between equals. And then they started organizing conferences and smaller meetings and working groups, from the mid-70s onwards. And I became involved.
Sort of what? Give us an example of the breadth of the program.
Well, some of the medical side was looking into the healing mechanisms, for instance, and then there was also an interest in spirituality and spiritual and mystical experience, which the founders all had. In other words, they had a flip, as Jeff Kripal would call it, a flip from an outside-in perspective to an inside-out perspective. And then there was in fact a conference held at the University of Surrey in 1974 on evidence for reincarnation, which we've been talking about. And Peter Leggett and Max Payne, who was an early member as well, actually wrote a book about this. And Peter also wrote another book about the environment. And so that's been another area. And we had close connection with Emerson College, which was founded on Steiner principles. And John Davey was the then principal of it, who was also a Guardian newspaper columnist.
Okay. Keep listing the things. I'm really just trying to get a sense of everything, all of the different areas that have been connected.
Well, and more, we then had, as things developed, we had smaller groups meeting at these different interfaces. So we had a group on science and consciousness, a group on science and spirituality, a group on science and esotericism, looking at the theosophical interface, for instance, or the anthroposophical interface. And then we teamed up with the Wrekin Trust, of which I was president until it was closed down, to start up the Mystics and Scientists conferences. So I've already mentioned Beyond the Brain conferences. The Mystics and Scientists conference was first held in 1978. And so a long time ago, and last year, 2020, we had to cancel it. And so we're hoping to have the live event as before in later in this year, 2021. And so that's been a series, again, looking at this complementarity between, I'm talking about rigorous mysticism here. I'm not talking about, that sort of what people disparagingly call woo-woo. These are experiences of unitive nature, of going beyond this separate consciousness. And a very good example of someone who actually embodies both of these aspects is Ravi Ravindra. So Ravi Ravindra is emeritus professor of physics and comparative religion at Dalhousie University in Canada. But he has also studied deeply with Jean de Salzmann, who was the successor of Gurdjieff, and also Krishnamurti. So David Bohm also had these dialogues with Krishnamurti. And so Ravi is someone who writes, for instance, about yoga and physics. And he says in yoga, you're taking a disciplined approach to the inner world and of spiritual training, as it were. And in science, you're taking a disciplined approach to the outer world. So he sees that one can apply equal rigor in both fields. And you've got this with contemplative neuroscience now.
I can't help imagining the listeners, a good portion of the listeners, squirming in their seats now. The mention of yoga in the same sentence as physics. It brings me on to an important question that we really want to cover in depth on Chasing Consciousness, which is about the limits of science. And you mentioned scientism, which is the idea that literally everything can be explained in those reductive sense and everything else is inadmissible. There's a really distinct issue emerging at the moment, sadly becoming quite heavily politicized as well. But let's just keep it to the science here. It's happening in the New Age and the wellness community, where the appropriation of scientific discoveries to form somewhat flimsy argumentations for mystical, non-physical realities beyond our own. A good example of this might be someone like Deepak Chopra talking about quantum consciousness without necessarily referring to a specific scientific theory or papers about, what exactly quantum consciousness is, or even if it's a real thing. And that's not to say that there might not be something to what he's saying. On the contrary, it's to say, surely if we want to bring the wellness community, the spiritual community, the New Age community into a place of reasonable, rational, evidence-based knowledge, surely we need to elaborate these ideas well. And this is, it's a twofold issue, because there's a risk that the important implications from the data coming from, let's just take an example, entanglement, which is something we're going to be going into a lot of detail on, because I think it's one of the key bridges between these two worlds. And I'm sure you're looking into it at the Scientific and Medical Network as well. There's a risk that they're looked at as pseudo-scientific and therefore not fundable for serious research, not qualified for realistic philosophical argumentation, and actually not even a subject that you could expect a famous scientist to speak about publicly. But secondly, it also risks the public who, like me, for example, are sitting on the fence, waiting for good evidence to confirm their logical view either way, to be switched off from these concepts altogether. Basically, that concept loses credibility in the public field, because basically it's been put out there in an uncredible and badly explained way. So with that backdrop, I'm going to split this question in two. First of all, where do you personally believe that the limits of science are? And do you think that we are foolish to expect a post-material science to find a place in this kind of question?
As it were, the appropriation of metaphors. So quantum is a good example of that, and Dana Zohar has used it in a sort of wide sense as well. And I think maybe the publishers have got something to be responsible for here, because they want to come up with a good title.
Mm-hmm.
and so that authors don't always like the titles that they come up with, but sometimes they have to go along with them. And so to the extent that an analogy is used loosely and not properly explained, then that's damaging to the as it were the field. But looking at Deepak's contribution, he's written a lot of serious books and material as well. And what he basically defends in a philosophical sense is idealism. And he has, and this again is something we talked about earlier, that the idealism is becoming more important. In other words, the primacy of consciousness argument and everything derived from this primacy of consciousness is so that's really the first point. The second point is what are the limits of science? And I've got one of the first books written, popular books written on this by Sir Peter Medawar. They're called The Limits of Science, who was a Nobel Prize winner in physiology. And what the way that science has developed is that it's tended to look exclusively from this third person angle, the outside detached observer, the mechanical, the measurable, the primary qualities that we were talking about in the first part, and say, well, that is science. And to the extent that you can define that, and of course there are very many different sciences, it's difficult to talk about science in general, and then you could say that its method, generally speaking, is looking from the outside in. Mm-hmm. But of course the problem with that is that you have to assume the inside aspect in order to get the outside in the first place, which goes back to this point made by Max Planck. So the question is, and this Mary Midgley did a lot of work on this, and her last two books, What is Philosophy For and Are You an Illusion, address these ideas very robustly. Her second book was published when she was 99. She died when she was 99. But she takes these philosophers and scientists on, and particularly Peter Atkins is a good example of someone who believes in what he calls the omnicompetence of science. And so the idea is that if we haven't yet explained things in physical material terms, and that includes consciousness, it's only a matter of time before we do it. I don't think that's the case. I think that we need, just as we have a science outside in, we need to apply the same kind of systematic approach to the inner world, which Alistair Hardy started doing with his classifications of different types of experience.
But doesn't the scientific method break down in some way, at least in the way we've been using it up until now?
What I was going to mention, which again it's this complementarity, is that Goethe developed an approach which was then taken forward by Rudolf Steiner and now by what's called Goethean science. And that's what Brian Goodwin, who was an evolutionary systems biologist, he called a science of qualities. And so he said that what we understand now as science is a science of quantities, but there is a complementary science of qualities, which itself has its own form of rigorous method, which Goethe actually elaborated in considerable detail. Henri Bergson was one of the people, Arthur Science. There's a whole literature of Goethe's approach to science, which, as I say, I see as complementarity. So I think there's a limit to physical science. And I think that the limit that we're coming up against here is precisely in the area of consciousness studies. Because as somebody said, consciousness is not an object. Consciousness is the ultimate subject.
So how do we get around it? Like, do we need to develop a new method to deal with these qualities?
Well, you could say, and this is what's so interesting about the Mind and Life Institute, and what's this conversation between Buddhism and science. That someone like Alan Wallace is a very good example, and with his work, who's both a PhD in physics and a Buddhist monk. and he would say that the introspection and those spiritual training methods that have been applied in Buddhism over 2,500 years are a form of inner science. And you have to remember that science actually means knowledge. Scientia means knowledge. And so there are different kinds of knowledge, different levels of knowledge. And even in the Western tradition, there is a knowledge which comes through the senses, which is primarily what science talks about. Then there's a knowledge of reason and logic. Then there's a third kind of deeper knowledge, which is noesis in Greek. Plato talks about this in the Republic, which is gnosis, which is knowledge by identification, where you, the knower, are not an objective observer. You are a participator. You are that knowledge yourself. The knower and the known are not separate. And so I think we need to go into a deeper ontology and epistemology here to try and look at how this deeper form of knowledge can be mapped on to the concepts we already use.
And I wonder if we'd be able to bring the scientists with us. I mean, this is my great, great hope, is that with the tipping point we mentioned in part one, where perhaps the fact that it's less controversial to start talking about consciousness research now, and that will slowly just begin to open up. David, playing devil's advocate for a moment, there's a potential criticism of organizations like the Scientific and Medical Network that I wanted to get your view on. Your program regularly, as you just mentioned, features spiritual and mystical subjects alongside empirical science like quantum physics, including words like sort of divine. I was personally quite surprised when I saw this on the website because I'd been drawn to the scientific name of your organization. My fear is that any sort of post-materialist organization that engages with the scientific community or calls on scientific methodology needs to sort of remain in that field alone, or they risk just being branded as pseudoscientific and therefore being completely thrown out with the baby thrown out with the bathwater, or on the other hand, just preaching to the choir. So you're not actually really reaching anymore on the fences. What do you think about the idea that maybe now, later in the lifespan of the scientific and medical network, that the name should perhaps reflect a little bit more the two sides that you're trying to bridge? Because if I understand correctly, you are bridging these two worlds. That's the attempt, isn't it?
Yeah, well, you won't be surprised to hear that over the years we have debated and discussed the name of the Scientific and Medical Network on more than one occasion.
So I'm not the first person to level this criticism.
Oh, it's an observation in a sense, rather than a criticism. The origins of why it was called the Scientific and Medical Network was really to try and give a certain amount of credibility to the events we were putting on and actually engaging serious scientists and medics. And there is at one level that there used to be a distinction between full members and associate members. And actually, to my regret, this was voted off. I would rather have actually kept that distinction. And in a way, the professional affiliates and advisors of the Galileo Commission are now, if you like, the serious scientific and medical aspect of the network, but under another name. And so it was all this question of acceptability, respectability, and credibility. In order to be credible, you have to be respectable. In order to be respectable, you have to be acceptable. And it's the nature of the network that we actually operate at the frontiers of acceptability, credibility, and respectability, which is actually an interesting way of putting it. But we could, my daughter also made this observation. Why is it called the Scientific and Medical Network? Shouldn't it be called the Scientific and Spirituality Network, or the Science and Spirituality Network, for instance, which would be a good description? Or should it just be called the network, without any kind of scientific and medical? So I think we might well revisit this, but I'm just explaining that at the origins, there was a specific reason why it was scientific and medical. And we were never going to be restricting ourselves totally to these areas, but rather the interface between science, consciousness, and spirituality. So it's these interfaces that we're really interested in.
And the bridge, I see myself when I think about my callings, as it were. I really feel the need to bridge that, and I think that there is a lot of gray area in the middle between these areas of what lies beyond scientism in the realm of the mystical or the psychic, or the psychical, I should say, that to do with the mind, that literally is beyond the scope of the method. And I just wonder, referring back a little bit to that problem I just spoke about with the New Age and the wellness community, and the huge amount of criticism that they are coming under from the more secular scientific community, that because there's so much polarity in our modern world, and more need for bridges between those two than ever before, I just wonder if it's not important for us to do what it says on the tin, as it were, more than ever, in order to avoid just being sort of thrown out as pseudoscientific. However, another point about pseudoscience is that the consensus is always, as you said, there's a lag on consensus. Consensus is the agreement made after many years of assessing new data. So perhaps in a way, the original meaning of pseudoscience being new science, it's like we haven't yet integrated that, or it's in contrast with the consensus, and therefore it's not surprising that scientists such as Rupert are not even listed on Wikipedia as scientists, only as authors. And maybe we just have to accept that that's just the reality of being on the frontier.
Well, the thing is that a lot of these terms are weaponized.
Oh yes,
and so the term pseudoscience is a weaponized term, which is used rhetorically more generally than it is strictly as a definition of what is or isn't pseudoscience. And there's really a cultural war going on, what Craig Weiler calls a psi war. And this is absolutely up front in TED, and particularly in Wikipedia, because the so-called guerrilla skeptics, organized by Susan Gerbich, they curate all the parapsychology pages and all the complementary medicine pages to make them sound as skeptical and credulous as possible. And if you try and change these entries, like something on Rupert's biography page, it immediately gets changed back, and you're then threatened with being banned for life from any editing of Wikipedia. And these are 20-something-year-olds in the main who are doing this work. And so it's like there's a kind of cultural policing going on. And it's not surprising, if given this power of the skeptical movement, that scientists who are on the fence don't want to go into dangerous, forbidden areas in case they get attacked as well.
Absolutely.
Now, I think this is it's a serious problem, because for me, and this applies to what people call conspiracy theories as well, everything should be assessed in terms of claims and evidence. What are your claims, and what's your evidence for your claim? And to use these weaponized terms as a ways of closing down the discussion doesn't seem to me philosophically respectable.
Nor very progressive. I mean, surely, if we are talking about an evolved society and making sure that everything's fact-based and empirical, surely, we need to look at the facts. We need to look at the data. Anyway, David, just because we're coming up to the end, I feel it really important that we talk about your new book, A Quest for Wisdom, which is coming out this year and will be out by the time this airs. Tell us all about your new book, David. What is the objective of the book, and how do you take the reader there?
Well, it was my friend Andrew Powell, who is the founder of the Royal College of Psychiatrists Spirituality and Psychiatry group. He published some essays and talks, which I reviewed, and I enjoyed that. And so I approached his publishers, Eon, and said, "Well, would you like a volume of mine, which would bring together 25 essays I've written. The first one goes back to 1978, and then the most recent one is in the last 5 years. And that they are, and what I do there is I describe what I call the formative background. In other words, how did my thinking and my reading and my understanding evolve? And then I have a section on philosophy, meaning, and spirituality, then consciousness, death, and transformation. And then the final one is called Taking Responsibility, Ethics, and Society. And so it's actually a very wide-ranging book, which reflects, it's like a diamond in a sense. It reflects a number of different facets of my interest and my quest, which is involved not only spiritual practice, but also a vast amount of reading, which continues, as you're probably aware, because I review about over 150 books a year.
Wow. You must check out David's website, listeners, because there are an extraordinary range. And I think this is one of the most wonderful things, not only about you, David, but also about the Scientific and Medical Network, is that you're not afraid to include. It's very inclusive. It's very open. And as you said before, it's considering things on merit and not having any a priori judgments about them. Go on about A Quest for Wisdom, David.
Yeah, so that really, I suppose if I look at the how these things evolved for me, and I suppose when I started in the merchant bank, which is a kind of conventional Etonian thing to do, and then I realized very soon this just wasn't me, But I spent 2 years in the bank, and then I kind of ejected out of it. And I took 4 boxes of books abroad to France, where I resumed a job guiding people around the champagne cellars. And so I spent half the day reading and half the day entertaining visitors. And that worked very well, because I read those 4 boxes of books during that following year. And that's really formed the basis of the essays in the book, but also all my subsequent development. I was lucky enough to be able to take that year, that formative year, if you like, to lay the foundations of this quest that's gone on ever since, and which still continues.
Well, and I wonder how much it may map onto other life and truth seekers' experience of discovery as they go through their lives, reading, reflecting, thinking, looking at the huge range of points of view on all of these things and coming to their own conclusions, which is a very beautiful and quite universal story. So listeners, you must go out and take a look at that if you are interested in any of the deep questions we've been discussing today. David, thank you so much for your generosity with your time, and for, I think I'd like to say, humility in terms of having what I think is absolutely crucial in this time of polarity and judgmentalism and defensiveness. I feel a genuine humility and openness and tolerance and an acceptance of the fact that we all have different points of view of this, and they're all valid, and we can all be heard. And I think that these are important values in the scientific field, and it's really important that we break through a lot of the polemic that we're seeing at the moment based on the sort of social media AI engines and the echo chambers. And really we just get back to looking at, good old empirical fact and argumentation. So thank you so much, David. I don't think I've ever heard so many authors referenced in such a short time. So David, if you don't mind, I would be hugely grateful if you could furnish me and the listeners with a list of the authors you've spoken about today. Obviously, you've mentioned so many. I don't expect you to remember them all, and I shall be feeding that back to you and asking for some links to some of this research and to these books, because it's just an absolute wealth. There's a reading list of a lifetime just there, and I can only imagine how many books you've read in all of your life. So, David, thank you. It has been utterly illuminating. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. And just as a parting shot, Schopenhauer said that in the 19th century, if only when one bought a book, one could buy the time to read it in.
Oh goodness, don't.
And that is our problem now. We have so little time. But the fundamentals of life remain the same. And for me, it's really about the practice of love and the pursuit of wisdom. That's my bottom line.